then what you have now is the possibility of people who are thinking about these things coordinating and finding one another without the institution solving the coordination problem. Because you always have a coordination problem of how, say, people who are thinking about these things find one another, right? And that has, please.
Yeah, this is, I don't know, just the last 5 minutes you've been talking about this really is ringing a lot of bells with some of the stuff going around in TLC.
Mm,
This little corner of the internet. Recently, Paul Vanderklay and Christian Baxter went to the ARC,
mm,
which is some conference over in London about responsible citizenship. And they were having a lot of critiques about it. Like, what's the point of this? Are we here just listening to speakers? Why couldn't we do this online? Then, like, part of this is networking. It's like, hey, all these people that are interested in being responsible citizens will come together and there'll be
right.
talks. But then there's people there, and then you can get and you can
Mm-hmm.
interact with them. And so then they were running these things they call estuaries, where they have conversations with different people and they get a little bit more intimate. And I thought that there was something really interesting there because we all are coming from this space where, like, the existing institutions as they are aren't really working. And so we're trying to reformulate the institutions. But then we need institutions of interest to bring people together, and then those people together can then make changes or
Yes.
something like that. And so it's,
Mm-hmm.
how do you get people
Yep.
oriented around a thing that then doesn't set the orientation?
Yep.
Like
Yep.
what we were talking about earlier is we're trying to set environments for interaction. And so then something like that ARC can set the tonos or the environment or the spirit of relation around being a responsible citizen. And then people from all over the world will fly into that.
Yep.
And then they can have those embodied interactions and they can follow what's meaningful to them. And then there's something in that where we can get people who are guided by institutions and people who are wealthy enough to fly across the country and take time off of work and do all these things, people who are competent and whatever, and we get them to network, and then those kind of movers and shakers can actually make more change in the world. And there's something about, kind of the institutions as they are that isn't working, but the need to work through institutions because that's how things get done. And so then how do you use institutions to inspire people to transcend the institution or something to that? I don't know. So whatever you were saying just kept reminding me of the ARC stuff going on in TLC. So
Well,
I
that's
wanted to bring
that.
that.
Well, what you're getting at though is the root of the issue, and so there are there are things that people will call network effects. You have social network effects. You have institutional logic, et cetera, so forth. So the key is institutions in a way are healthy when there is a healthy space outside of institutions. And the only way there's a healthy space outside of institutions is if people in institutions don't identify with the institutions. And it goes back to the
Yeah.
identification problem.
The identification. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you see, the issue is there's a difference between not holding a pen, okay? Like I'm not holding anything, gripping a pen like this, and then letting a pen go. The hand that lets the pen go is not the same as the hand that never held the pen, right? So there's one, I don't have a pen, so I have nothing. Then there's, I'm gripping, but then there's the hand that had a pen and let it go. Institutions are healthiest when people are able to let institutions go, which is different from never having institutions. You have to have the
Yeah.
institutions
Okay.
for the
Okay. I see what you're talking
negation.
about. Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
Hegel emphasizes negation, sublation, and different things. So another example is the relation between cities and farms, right? The biggest farms tend to be around the biggest cities. They're not either or. It becomes a feedback loop, symbiotic, that makes them healthy. And when farms
Mhm.
are corrupted in their logic by the agenda of the city, the food agriculture becomes poison.
Yes.
And when
Yeah.
also the city no longer has the farm, or the farm then says, screw the city, I don't need it anymore, well, then you get pathologies, you get political ramifications, you get bad policy, et cetera, so forth, right? So like New
Okay.
York, as you know, like New York is primarily a farm state. It just has New York City, right? So you have this interesting irony where the most urban places depend on the rule, and vice versa. And they have to have an alignment of their mutual respect for one another and understanding that together they're able to do something they can't do apart. So likewise, it goes with institutions and spaces outside of institutions. And this is where the faithful presence comes into alignment with someone like Randall, et cetera, so forth, right? You could also mention like the Benedict option, I suppose, a little bit here. It's the idea that what you want to do is do something like the TLC, where you have a faithful presence to the work of the TLC, while simultaneously making it transparent to the institutions to see putting it in a place where people in the institutions who are dissatisfied by the institutions can then come to the TLC, have a certain, oh, there actually is something beyond the institution. And then that gives them the confidence to go back into the institution and actually begin changing it from the inside, where the institution regains its health. But it's only able to do that because there are people on the outside that are basic, like the monasteries on the trade routes or different things, right? That actually then get people back up to health to go into the institutions to make them places that don't identify with the institution. Because that's the kind of trick. Is an institution is demonic when it's identification. I know Luke has mentioned institutions as
Absolutely,
demonic
yeah.
and things like that.
Yeah.
Everything that identifies with itself is demonic. Identification is demonic, right? And so it is not that nothing is necessarily demonic, even if everything has a tendency toward the demonic, because it requires a multi-dimensionality that uses more energy. Therefore, everything has a tendency toward the demonic because it's easier. If flatness is easier to maintain than roundness, but actually, funny enough, this gets at the mystery of when God's like, the yoke is light, but take up your cross. There's a mystery there. Like, why is it that sometimes it's like Christianity is the hardest thing in the world, and other times it's mysterious? Making the spear is very hard. But once you do it and you
Once
get
you're in
into
it.
its own
Yeah.
orbit, then you're like, I can't imagine doing something else, right? So, likewise, when you get into right relation with a thing, it is very hard to get in the right relation, but it's very easy to keep it. But this is also why if you don't keep it, the fall is so great. That's why Lucifer becomes
Right.
the highest angel becomes the fallless one, because it was actually, you could
Mm.
say, it was the easiest of all possible things for Lucifer to stay an angel because he had that height of glory. And the fact he didn't is why it automatically inverses into being the worst of all possible things, right? Like, those are the stakes. Like, it would kind of be cosmically unjust if it wasn't that way. But so the more you move toward the spear geometry, the more it is easy to stay on the spear, but also then therefore why if you fall off of it, the consequences are so incredibly dire. It automatically inverts. Because if you went from the flat to the spear and you go back to the flat, well, why would you go back then, right? That's kind of why it inverts so demonically so quickly, right? But that all said, there is something that once you actually get higher dimensionality, it's hard to get there, but it becomes easy to stay there. And then the faithful presence of just doing the work of staying there becomes a joy in of itself. Friendship becomes the point, not capital per se. Friendship and relations become the things you enjoy because you find yourself in a higher dimension relationship, having ideas you never had before. Your ability to be aware increases. This is critical. A friendship
That's
makes you more aware. This is why friendship and philosophy are inseparable, because friends
yes,
help
I
you
love.
gain awareness. And you see that friends are how you love wisdom, right? You don't
Mm.
love wisdom by sitting down with a philosophy book and making yourself read it. You love wisdom when the philosophy book is integrated into a friendship, that then it becomes the material of the friendship, but the friendship is primary to the book. And that's actually how the book is supposed to be. It's to the glory of the book per se. When it is left behind, when it is dropped in the friendship. You know how we said like the difference between never reading a book, grasping to the book. Most intellectuals hold the book tightly, like the pen, right?
I
They
hold
hold
it.
this is
Yeah.
I'm a specialist. This is the truth, right? No. The point
I
of
identify with this book. Yeah.
exactly the point of philosophy is to drop it. Like, and that's
Yeah.
actually funny enough what we see
Is to
many
be
of the
confident enough to drop it.
exactly. Because it's become you. Because you love it, right? Like there is a long tradition of many of the greatest philosophers basically being like, burn the books, like obviously Aquinas, but then Plato is like, I don't write. It's like writing is dangerous. There's this note. Why is writing dangerous? This is always weird. Why is writing dangerous? Because writing is the possibility of information without relationship. Oral
Mhm.
requires information to have a relationship. Writing allows the possibility of writing without relationship. Now, writing gave us a more flexible memory. We could become more creative, as William Ong and Marshall McLuhan said. But also in the act of gaining that creativity, it only is valuable if we bring it back to the relationship. The gains of the book must be brought back to the relationship, but the book brings the temptation of identifying with the book. The book brings with it the
Okay.
temptation of stagnancy. Please.
Yeah, I want to get in on this. So if we contrast the flat unidimensional one plane with the spherical multidimensional whatever,
Sure.
and we talk about addiction being narrowing, and then we talk about humans being sapiential, intellectual oriented. And then we talk about humans evolving and becoming more dependent on that which made them adaptive. And so now we're extremely dependent, extremely addicted, and extremely blindly possessed by the intellectual rationality, something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and then going back, if society enculturates its citizens to be machines of productivity, that's a flat, unidimensional, we're going to treat them as exercisers of capital or ability to acquire capital or whatever. And so that general incentivizing of a flattening of the identification of the public, something like that. Are you following me
Yep.
so
Yep.
far?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So if you are trying to be in community with a whole bunch of people who have been flattened, so to speak, by society, how do you partake in a magical, fulfilling relationship that takes place on the spherical dimension or the spiritual dimensions that are then beyond the scope of the materialistic paradigm that we have pretended to conform to because of all the things that I just kept saying? So there's something where I feel like most of the you said it was once you get into that spherical, it's easy to relate. It's really hard to transition from flat to
Yes.
spherical. But once you're living in that spherical world, then it's very vivifying.
Yes.
And so then if you are a bodhisattva, you go off into the wilderness, you become enlightened, and then it's only the bringing it back down to society that matters. So when society is flattened and you have learned to go make things spherical, and then in that sphericality, you're finding embodiment and purpose and connection, and you're becoming more vitalized. How do you go back to the
Yes.
flat,
Yep.
dead society of mechanistic overfitting to the data, of regurgitation,
Yep.
of competitive dynamics,
Yep.
of all of that? And then where is that back and forth, and how do you
Yeah.
manage that without going insane or blowing your brains out?
That is the question. And I would also, Cadell asked, and Cadell had this class on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I think it's extremely important to see Zarathustra as this question. Zarathustra does
Yeah,
not go
that's
on a journey to enlightenment. He's already enlightenment, and he's coming
right. He's
down the
coming down.
mountain.
Yeah.
He starts out coming out of the cave, Plato's allegory, and there is the sun. He has to go down. I should also note that when I say it is easy to stay in the sphere, I mean by that it is easy to get. You get it. Like you get it now. You've apprehended it, you've seen it, and you now get that this is higher dimensionality and this is what is fitting for the human being. I do not mean by that that it is necessarily easy to spread it or to bring it
To
into a
maintain it.
social context.
Okay. Just to
Um,
keep it
and
going.
and
Okay.
actually, we could say our historic moment is one where people have generally learned how to be a spear in isolation or in a very
Right. Right.
occult or isolated. The challenge now is how to be
To broaden.
spherical broadly.
Yeah.
And that's what
Yeah.
we're thinking. That is the not thought problem of our historic moment. That basically meaning crisis, AI, economic stagnation, and all of these things are saying you must solve, you must deal with. And there's a few things with that on this idea of how you bring out a broader change the world. It is a mixture of forcing functions, faithful presence, faithful presence being so the forcing functions are the meaning. It's really important to not see the meaning crisis as necessarily a bad thing because it can be the forcing function that makes people consider alternatives that they otherwise wouldn't have thought because this isn't working,
Yeah.
right? I would actually argue on the social, a lot that we try to do in Belonging Again is to argue that economics started from imagination based on Dietrich McCloskey, Carl Planier, all of these different people, because economics, I would argue capitalism, I agree with Cohn and Keynes and other people that capitalism is actually stagnating. You have the great stagnation that is occurring, which ultimately looks like wealth inequality. When you have stagnation of growth, then the growth tends to be captured by a smaller and smaller part of the pie, right? So you have the great stagnation occurring. You have the meaning crisis occurring, which please note, the meaning crisis, I think this is really important. We actually do know how to give meaning. Bigotry, racism, xenophobia, nationalism, closed-mindedness. The meaning crisis is a crisis for those of whom do not want to go back to old ways of getting meaning, right? Or who find themselves lost, not knowing what to do. So there's actually a kind of hope in the meaning crisis, meaning that we're looking for a new source of meaning that is not
Right.
regressing to
It's
previous
it's a
forms of
more
meaning.
fulfilling source of meaning.
Exactly. That's
It's
right.
a more accurate source of meaning. We've had all these misguided, oversimplified,
Yes.
decadent, faux sources of meaning. And we're starting to realize after generations of consuming these lesser quality forms of experience that we actually desire a different, more fulfilling kind of experience.
100%.
And
And
and then it's but there's just there are no there those experiences are no longer around. They've atrophied out, they've starved out, they've been competed over, they've been crossed off, they've been crucified, they've been actually killed off or whatever. Like it seems like we were growing up deprived of those inspirational sources of either people who are good at exercising that we can model our behavior after, or arenas that we can practice our own exercising and develop our own character and then develop our dexterities from within rather than modeling on somebody. Like either way, we're kind of lacking that meaningful inspirational engagement or something like that.
100%. And the reason why I think that's an important point is because if people still find meaning in an old way, they have to do it at the top of political power or in the conspiracy or like by having the government go back to a certain previous social organization. So the reason why I say this is because it is not simply that people can't find meaning, is that if they are finding meaning, it's to the service of power. It's to the service of, say, well, basically cults or various kind of
But
closed communities that lead to, well, extremism, us versus them dynamics, and other sort of problems. But I would argue even those have lost their ability to ground like they used to because of the internet, because of connectability. So they have a weakness to them, but they still can be things people can turn to that lead to an inefficiency because there's a certain regression. So now to that, there is obviously also people who have nihilism and don't see meaning as well. But I guess I want to say it's a constellation of different approaches that people have to the problem that is showing up politically. It is maybe showing up in terms of, say, extreme ideology. And by identifying that, it means the following. It's not simply a matter of giving people a new meaning. It's giving them a geometrical meaning versus an algebraic meaning. It is a meaning, like you said, of a higher dimensionality. Because if we're
yeah,
not careful, we may simply say, well, what we need to do is reintroduce a new algebraic meaning or give people new, because that's, I guess the example I'm making there, that's what all the corporations did. We'll just have them work and we'll give them meaning at Google. We'll give them purpose at our new Silicon Valley thing. So what ended up happening is personal expression and meaning and purpose and all of that can actually be commodified by capital to make it seem like they
right.
care about this stuff, but it's
But
actually
that's
still
not it.
algebraic. So
But
there's a
that's just lies. That's just deception.
it's
Yeah.
just lies, right? Because it's but that's where you could say discernment and reasoning actually have for me, the main role of thinking is self-defense. The ability to self-defend yourself from the appearance that isn't actual, the appearance of meaning that's not the actuality of meaning, we might say. I mean, you could argue that like the whole Plato project is basically the distinction between appearance and actuality. But by that, he doesn't mean in a Kantian sense. He means it in a deception sense. He means it in like it's really hard because we're surrounded by deceptions. We're
Yeah.
surrounded by manipulation. And of course,
Yeah.
that is a Christian teaching. Like, Satan can't have direct power. It has to be deceiving power
Right.
against
Exactly.
itself because
Yeah.
because it's privational in this sense. And I think like that. So for me, and I'll give it to you on any thoughts on that. It's just really important that when we talk about the meaning crisis, we identify that it is a meaning of a higher dimensionality, not just meaning as of any sort, right? Because if it is meaning of any sort, that could just lead to atomization and people separating from one another with their meaning, right? The problem is social intelligibility, dang it. Like there are lots of people that say, for example, find poetry meaningful and they do it in private and they value it but then when they have to talk about poetry with other people who make them feel like they're wasting their time or they're not productive, then they back out, right? So I also will talk about distinctions between meaning and belonging, which I think are different. I think they overlap. You have to have meaning, but you also have to have belonging. And you have to have belonging, but you also have
Yeah.
to have meaning. You have to have both, because if you have meaning but not social intelligibility, there will still be an alienation. But if you have social intelligibility but not meaning, it's a univoke, it's a universe, it's a single substrate. You end up losing dimensionality in it, and it falls apart. So you need both of these things. But then the question of belonging is tied to the question of institutions and how you change institutions, how you change the economy, how you actually learn the skill of communicating with otherness and stuff like that. I'll pause.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of good stuff there. So we've talked about a meaning crisis. And I think ultimately that's kind of an identity crisis. And then ultimately that's an association with belonging. How do your mental maps imply or apply to your physical life? Um, and there's something about our jobs, like if you think about again like a pyramid, because I'm going to be Egyptian and Western in my thinking about what God is and what meaning is and what purpose is.
Absolutely.
So you get this sort of pyramid of, I don't know, you want to put like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like there's things that are of priority. And it seems as though the more advanced a society gets, the more potential ways of identifying yourself. You can
Yeah.
identify yourself as a doctor or as a blacksmith or as a father or as a sports player or as a writer or whatever. And there's all of these ways that we are tempted to over-identify with. And then we've created a culture of almost over-identifying with the roles. And then by picking a role in the pyramid to aim at, we're like aiming lower and lower or something
Yes.
like that.
Hmm.
And so the more that we identify with our, I don't know, facticities or our involvements, the physical things, the less we are identifying with that moral compass of the North Star, of the
Hmm.
polarity of morality, of into like again I don't know
Yep.
the words of art.
Absolutely.
But and so there seems to be something about the culture of the last few generations or just advanced cultures or just first world cultures in general. Again, I don't know how to describe these things, but there's something where we have lived our lives aiming at proximal goals in
Hmm.
such a way that we're disoriented and we no longer can even imagine what a transcendent goal is or
Yeah.
something like that, where we're so captivated by the momentary presence of facticity that we forget the underlying through line of something. And so we
Hmm.
have all of these meanings and these conceptualizations that are on like a flat plane that aren't really meaningful to our full embodied spirit. And
Correct.
so then we fill ourselves with this one plane of existence, and that technically, yeah, it's filling us, sure, but like not really.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so there's a sort of, yeah, I don't know. Those were the thoughts that were
Yeah.
going through my head.
No, I think it's well. So if this is, if I'm here, there's less to identify with. So it's easier not to make. It's easier to go that way because there's less here to tempt me. But the more I go this way, the more there
Interesting.
is to
Yeah.
identify with.
Okay.
Right? When
Yeah.
belonging is ultimately found in this motion, per se. But the higher I am, the more there is below me, per se, to identify with. Right? So
Yeah.
as you go
Yeah.
up, the mistake becomes easier and easier. Right? But also, I do think, therefore, if you
Yeah.
don't make the mistake, the potential is greater, right? The potential of different creative possibilities, like the
Okay. Yeah.
creative possibility in a global pluralistic world is greater than the creative possibility in a less diverse world. But that creativity is way harder to realize and requires much more skillfulness and depthness, right?
Right. And I think
For,
that's where we're at.
yes.
We're at a place in society where we're so organized and we're so structured and we're so successful and we're so connected by all of our technology that we actually don't have an embodied way
No.
to realize that creative energy.
No.
And so I think there's a significant portion of the population that has a significant amount of creativity that's just being flushed down the proverbial toilet. Like it's just, yeah, I don't know.
100%. And this is where there's
And so I
always.
think there's a ton of meaning to be found. There's a ton of
Yep.
connection to be found.
Hmm.
There's ample amounts of meaning out there, but and there's ample amounts of technology, yet we're in a meaning crisis. And like
Yes.
that shouldn't make sense, but somehow that seems to be the absurdity of where we're at.
Oh, well, 100%. Well, For me, also, this direction is fundamentally a faith activity because you can't see the thing, right? So this direction
I
is
like that
always
faithful
faith.
presence.
Yeah, that faithful presence. That's exactly right. And also
I'd never heard that
critically,
before. That's a good word. Yeah.
I do like it, and I think the case for why that is how you quote unquote change the world is very strong. Because we can also
Yeah,
tie it
absolutely.
to the great
That's
enrichment.
the opposite of the intellectual
Yes.
stance, the
Uh-huh.
intellectual,
Hmm.
rational, skeptical. I'm living in a world of hyper objects, kind of, versus I am present and faithful. Like
Yeah.
there's totally difference between I'm Cain and planned, and I'm
Yeah.
able and faithful. And
Well,
like
and a good example of
that
what
spiritual transition, I think, is huge.
it is
And I think
very
we can
huge.
practice that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I bring that up as well because when you were speaking about Vanderklay at ARC with Christian, you're at ARC, but you're there creating these estuaries, and and so you're having a faithful presence to the estuary that is at
Mm-hmm.
ARC, but is not reducible to ARC, right? It is happening in the institution per se, or you could say
Within the
the
structure.
thing,
Yeah.
but it is also distinct from. That's the key.
Because it's a
Faithful.
creative play within a structure. It
That's the
isn't the
key.
structure
Yes,
itself.
that's what changes the world. If you grant me this, that's what changes the world. The ability,
I
it's
think so. I think those arenas of engagement are the living engagement that is the antidote to
yes,
the meaning crisis of dead philosophies, of the
yes,
structure, of the
hmm
stasis,
yeah,
of the frozen
hmm
pretense that we think we have to. Yeah.
100%. And because the key to this, if
So
you
how do we
have
make that contagious? How do we make that desirable? How do we make the masses who don't think about this stuff all the time listen to us talk and be like, "Oh, yeah, I would participate in that. That's interesting." How do you make it interesting to flat folks or whatever the case may be? You know
mo
what I mean?
mo
Like a
models, you have to model it. You can't just tell people; they have to see it. People are changed by what they see, not by what they are told. And this is
right. That's a
where
real word. Okay.
the unique combination of YouTube, Zoom, videos online. What is occurring is it is the creation of portfolios, not resumes. For most of history, we've organized new institutional possibilities by resumes. Now we're
Wow.
all making
Okay.
portfolios. And by definition, faithful presence is always slow, but it is not a linear. Here's the critical point. Social transformation is not linear, it's exponential. And exponential is very, very slow for a very long time, and then suddenly, bam, very, very fast. That's
Flat this way.
why the problem is faithful presence seems like it's doing nothing for a really long time, and then suddenly it's doing a whole lot exponentially, right? Because
So
the famous example of a exponential curve is if I ask you, I have a jar between noon and 1. At 1 o'clock, it will be full. At what time is it halfway full? Most people say 12:30. The answer is 12:59. At
mhm.
12:59, it is halfway full. And at 12:52, it's like nothing occurred, right? Exponential curves work in this mysterious way. And I think basically most spiritual transformations are exponential. And like and funny enough, once an exponential curve gets going, the change is radically fast, way faster than the linear curve. It jumps ahead of the linear curve incredibly quickly. But the only
So
possibility
can
of an
I
exponential curve is to do something for a long time that seems like you're not doing anything. But please, Charlie.
So I was really following that, and it got me to something else. There's something about these curves and these cycles of awareness and destruction and then rebuilding. And, we're trying to get to a sort of tipping point, to use Malcolm
Yeah,
Gladwell's word. But my question that arises, or the situation that I want to dialogue about, that phrasing presumes there is one paradigm that's in transformation.
sure,
But
sure,
I
sure.
believe it's something more like
Mm-hmm,
OG
mm-hmm,
has a paradigm, and Charlie has a paradigm, and he
mm-hmm,
has a paradigm, and they have a
mm-hmm,
paradigm.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So while my paradigm might have started 5 years ago, and I might be accelerating that at investing 20 hours a week into that, somebody else may have not
Yeah,
even seen that before, or they might have
yeah,
seen it and
yeah.
heard it, but it doesn't really make sense.
Mm-hmm,
And so the paradigms, I guess, exist in different people on different levels and different
mm-hmm,
contexts.
mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I don't know if I'm confusing it by adding that
No,
layer of
no, no.
complexity or not, but that's where my mind was going when you were talking about that.
This is extremely important. What is the exponential curve is harmony, not a particular, like, you know how harmony is seeing people who have different ideas, like modeling harmony versus isolation or singularity. Because what you see, say, on a TLC conversation is people that have enough similarity or enough etiquette to be able to say interact, but not necessarily following the same paradigm, even if there is enough commonality so relationality is possible, because that's the key. You can't be so different that you can't make sense of one another, but if you're too similar, then it's totalizing, right? So what we need to see is more so a model of how difference interacts without that
Yeah.
becoming chaos.
Right, which
This
is
is
what I was
all,
trying to talk about the Overton window
yes,
earlier.
that's
It's
correct.
like we don't have enough difference to make meaning,
Yes,
or we have so much difference that it's just
yes,
chaotic.
that's
We
correct.
don't have enough acceptance of the other to learn, or we have so much of the acceptance of other that we lose our sense of self.
100%. And that's the Leibniz
Mm.
problem. That's the mean problem. That's the virtue ethic problem of that middle between of similarity difference so that it's vibrant. If it's too far on the similarity side, it loses its vibrancy. But if it's too far on the different side, it loses its vibrancy. So that is a proportion. And people have to see that modeled because you're also been asking questions that are extremely important. Like, how do you talk? How do you disagree without hating one another? How do you disagree productively? Nobody knows. And also, if I
Yeah.
tell you how to do it in a book, you won't get it. We have to see it
Yeah,
modeled.
yeah.
We have to
You have
see,
to do it. You have to practice it.
you
Yeah.
have to practice it. And people have to see other people practicing it so they feel permission to do it themselves, right? So, this is where what's happening is, in my
Mhm.
opinion, Philosophy Portal, Voicecraft, Theory Underground, TLC, all of these different things, which have very different worldviews, with people with different worldviews, are nevertheless all modeling harmony as a way and mode of interaction, which must be experimental because that is the dynamism, but the experimental is the strength, not the weakness. Like you're always
Right.
testing, you're always trying anew, right? And that is what people have to see modeled. And it is that modeling that has the exponential curve, not a particular idea in the model. It is the way of interaction
Okay.
because this gets
So
to social skills and things. Please, please.
So this gets me thinking, I think a lot of our education is like a top down, here's the right answer to the test. Now you just remember it and regurgitate it
Yep.
back.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's something about that I'm asking you the question, how do we make these ideas interesting? And then you're saying, well, you actually have to model it. It has to be a bottom up, it has to be a
Yes.
participatory thing.
Yes.
And so then my thing is like we need like arenas to practice that and then yeah, or something. Where's the because what makes it real is actually seeing it happen.
Yep.
There's a
Mm-hmm.
difference between beta thinking
Mm-hmm.
and having a third party give you some hearsay of what happens,
Yep.
and then you like agreeing to that hearsay. And there's something entirely different of you actually being a part of that
Yep.
relation and you being
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable and you
Mm-hmm.
changing. That's
Mm-hmm.
totally different from you receiving data and then you knowing data and then everything working.
Yep.
And yeah, I think that sort of transition is huge.
Uh,
And I
if
don't really know how to elucidate it or model it or articulate it or practice it in an appropriate way that'll make it contagious or
Yep.
something to that effect.
Yep. Well, so there's a few things. First off, I think it is important to see that what is occurring in these spaces, the dialogos, as Vervaeke has perhaps called it, or circling of, there are different languages. There
Mhm.
are different,
Mhm.
basically, we're in the age of socio-technological experimentation, where Jonathan Rouse is doing an anti-debate. Jonathan, you got dialogos. You're going to see many different ways of having conversation with different sets of rules, game sets, different ways to see. And what you'll find is different experiments will give you different results, and perhaps different skill sets will develop from different ways of doing things, right? And so because of the technology of the social coordination mechanism, which is basically the Zoom YouTube combination, it is now possible to actually engage readily and often in social technological experimentation to see what can be afforded, what can be modeled, what works and what doesn't, which this was not really possible before because before, if I wanted to have experimentations and conversation, I was at the mercy of who in my immediate area wanted to do it, if I had time to do it, and so on and so forth. Well, now if I just have 20 minutes between laundry and dinner, I can jump on and I can do it with people all around the world. This changes things. It overcomes a massive social coordination problem that has never been done before. And I call it the social coordination mechanism because it is the dialectical variable needed for the pricing mechanism of Height, Capital, and von Mises, so that pricing doesn't do our thinking for us. We're able to use the market without it brainwashing it into thinking in terms of the market, right? Because pricing coordination, resource coordination is very valuable. The problem is it habituates you into only thinking according to capital,
It tends
right?
towards possession.
That's correct. So if you have the pricing coordination mechanism plus the social coordination mechanism, and you have a dialectic that is in a feedback loop informing those things, well, following Hegel to say something very large, where there is dialectic, there is imagination. Because dialectic, in that working back and forth, people eventually go, they're able to think, is it only a dialectic, or what new possibilities does this afford? This was critical for Hegel. Hegel did not primarily see himself as a dialectical thinker, but a speculative thinker, to go into speculation. The acknowledgement of dialectic opens up the capacity to speculate and to imagine, right? When you don't have a dialectic, you get trapped in a single substrate. You get trapped in a flatness. When you have a dialectic, you can avoid flatness. But then because it has movement, and once you have movement, it's possible to move vertically, right? If you're not moving at all, you're not going to move vertically. But once I get a dialectic going, people now have the ability to move from this to this, right?
You have a plane and they have a plane.
That's right.
Then you necessarily have to be crossing planes.
There you go. Exactly right. And so what we're seeing is the formation of the social coordination mechanism to dialectically work with the pricing mechanism so that you are able to bring back imagination, reasoning, higher dimensionality into the market so that you can get the benefits of the market without it leading to the flatness that capital naturally leads us to because it works. And so it also goes with AI and all of these other things, right? Because I do think that land, as Mikey talks about, like capital is basically autonomous rationality that's flat. That's what AI is. It's just a continuation of that into AI. And basically, a hope I have is that AI, the great stagnation, as a forcing function, precisely in their inability to give us greater dimensionality, is forcing people to consider alternatives and to become aware, even if they wouldn't naturally do it, because the environment no longer supports the thoughtlessness that has created the environment. And this is where it's kind of like, evil eats itself in a way. But Charlie, please.
Yeah, that's where the different people on different paradigms thing that I brought up a minute ago gets me. Because, and again, I hate to make differences, and
please.
Arrogant or whatever, but like for us to be thinking about this stuff is kind of unique. And then for us to forecast the future of where this is going is kind of unique. And then for us to be emotionally concerned about the forecast of where this is going is also a characteristic uniqueness. And so some people are still in the headspace where AI is still a convenience, where buying everything online is still good, whereas Amazon for everything is still good. And I still think there's a lot of people who are pushing a lot of momentum towards feeding the AI. Whereas you and I are sitting here like, oh, well, now that because the AI that recognizes the ability to have to be human. And so now AI is a stimulus for us to be more human. But I think for other people, that realization has not happened yet. And so I think they are still, oh, what's this new stuff? AI? Oh, well, that makes things easier. Well, oh, that's a one size fits all. Let's just AI everything. And then and so it's hard to, because when you were saying that, I was like, yeah, that's exactly how I think. But then I was like, well, how do the people around me act? Oh, they haven't even begun. No,
what you're saying is 100%, but this is for me why it has to be coupled with the faithful presence, because
it's not obvious to other people.
No, and it probably will not.
Conclusion of like, oh, AI is soulless, and so therefore there's all the more there's all the more inspiration to become ensouled because the culture is becoming soulless. I think very few people realize that. I think that's
No, you're 100%. This is why changing the world is a combination of the faithful presence and the forcing functions. Because the forcing function has to run its course. Like, unfortunately, and I think also here we can point to why philosophy has a certain role that is beneficial to do, even if you don't know what the function of it is. Basically, the majority of people always in history, unfortunately, have to experience the negatives of the previous to such an intensity that then it
Right.
forces change. Like
Okay,
you,
sorry. So then if we're getting back to where we're talking about consciousness is the awareness of the difference. I think people like us are conscious and we're aware of the difference and we're aware of the suffering, and that's why we want to change.
yes,
But I think society incentivizes you to not be conscious, to
yes,
not be aware of the
yes.
difference, to not realize you're suffering. And then my concern is that the greater mass of people are numb and not realizing
Hmm.
this. And
Yep.
I'm concerned that the three people talking about this online are just not a big enough presence to do that. There's not enough momentum. And
Oh no,
so, yeah.
but
But
that's
I think
also
then trying to find the momentum and trying to find the connectivity and trying to find the capitalistic connection that does that, then that kind of undermines the whole point of it.
exactly. But this is
And so,
why the presence requires a faith, because the faithful presence
right,
must
right, right,
always
right.
have the temptation of thinking that it's not enough. And the miracle is when
Sure.
people face that temptation and do it nevertheless, because faith and courage are tied. I really think the word
That,
faith is
yeah.
much
And so
stronger.
modeling and inspiration and encouraging and faith are all tied, but then the modeling undermines the faith, or like then that gives that a, yeah, I don't know.
If you
It's interesting.
model in a way that leaves the faithful presence and plays according to the logic of being seen, this is where someone like, it's a very interesting book, Malcolm Muggeridge on the fourth temptation, basically reimagines Jesus in the wilderness, and the Satan comes along and says, hey, I'll give you a global network to get the message of Christianity out, right? To use TV to tell everyone about Christianity. And Muggeridge poses this as a potential fourth temptation of using like telling everyone about Christianity, which will necessarily destroy the message of Christianity, right? It's
Hmm.
a
I think we're
fascinating.
dangerously close to that.
We are
Yeah.
dangerously close. Now, this is where the debate between people like Jaquaz Ali and the Technological Society, Neil, all of the McLuhan, obviously, Ong, Key, all these people. This is why that debate is very interesting, because it becomes the question: what is the if you don't use the medium at all, then you're out of the game. Okay. Like you're out of the game. But if you use the medium, you're in danger. Right. And this is
Right.
why we know how to be a spear in isolation. We are in the age of having to figure out how to be a spear using the medium, using the society in an economics.
Yeah.
And this is, and
To be the magician through the flatness.
that's
Yeah.
it. And for most of
Yeah.
history, a lot of people have basically said it's impossible. And maybe for most of history, it was impossible.
But
But this,
logically, top down, it's impossible. But spiritually, creatively, it's inevitable.
exactly. This is the trick. And this is why, again, I know I've mentioned Hegel a bit. There is a logic in Hegel that's critical. It is a progressive logic, but it's not progressive as it seems. It is a progress of the spiritual logic arising because of catastrophe, not because we get smarter. That reading of Hegel has been a big mistake, where we say, oh, in Hegel, rationality becomes more rational. No, no, in Hegel, we encounter our limits more and more, realize how dumb we are, and in realizing how dumb we are, we get a humility that opens up spirit, and the spirit becomes more creatively possible. So there's a progress that's an idea of we get smarter, and therefore don't make the same mistakes. And then there's another idea of progress that is, no, we encounter mistakes we didn't know were there, and if we survive them, then we have a humility that allows new creative possibility. So in Hegel, the future is better than the past, but there's no guarantee there's a future. That's the kind of rub, right? Yeah, sure, if we make it to the future, but then eventually the future eats itself, and it could always eat itself if you don't actually let the spiritual creativity come to the forefront, right? So it's a complicated picture of progress that I think is tied to this, but progress then is marked by greater challenge that unveils your inadequacy. This is the key. Progress always has to be through a revelation of inadequacy. We tend to think progress is a result of eliminating inadequacy. In Hegel, progress is
Right.
a
So
result of facing it and basically manning up to it, basically owning it.
that's the coming to consciousness that we were talking about earlier.
Yes,
That's the recognition of your faults earlier. That's the
yes,
awareness of your insufficiencies. That's realizing
100%.
you're naked before God, and that's what happens when you become conscious of something.
That's exactly right.
Uh,
No, that's exactly right. And so to me, with the faithful presence, like what you have is a situation of there are various forcing functions that are occurring, right? Dare I say, cultural strategy of faithful presence is where you say the goal is not to climb to the top of the institutions. It's to be in relation to the institutions and to be in the institutions
Right.
while having an influence, but staying faithfully present to the geometry, I'll say. You let the forcing functions do the scaling, not the climbing, not the top of the institution. The forcing functions are what then make people, because people are not open to difference until they've experienced the need for it, generally. One of the values of philosophy, the alternative, though, to the forcing function of devastation is the attraction of beauty. There's basically two ways you can change people in this deep ontological ways: beauty or devastation. And basically, religions have always orbited those two. A reason
Yeah.
why it can be very beneficial to do philosophy is because it increases the probability, if you do it in the friendship right, that you are changed by beauty and thus don't have to be changed by devastation, right? I much rather be changed to the actual through beauty than devastation. If you don't do friendship and beauty and theology and seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, if you don't do that, the only way you're going to deeply change is through devastation. That's simply how it has to work. It either is going to
So
be, please.
yeah. No, I think this is really good. This is what we're talking about. If two people are brought together in a spirit of honest conversation, then the fact that they live in the Tower of Babel is going to create a difference. And
Yes.
then to the extent they're paying attention, they're going to become conscious of the fact that there's a difference.
Yep.
And then how do you react to that difference? Then I think has moral implications.
Yes.
That would then contrast to what I was talking about, the Overton window of nice society where nobody ever disagrees and everybody pretends that everything's the same. That then creates an unconsciousness, and then there's no awareness of the difference. And then the only way you come to consciousness in that regard is devastation.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so our society creates a narcissistic delusional tyranny that then is only ever engaged in when you blow up.
Yes.
And so we are not individually courageous enough to have the hard confrontations of being honest and disagreeing with people, such that a greater unity can be found, such that we can humiliate each other often enough to adapt appropriately, rather than lie to each other and keep each other insulated until the only way they learn is to blow up and die.
Yep.
And so we are acting nicely and compassionately in the moment, but cursing each other to a devastating narcissistic
Yep.
loss of self and quarter life crisis or whatever, instead of just having a disagreement and being honest about things and then having people adapt and be good and healthy and having a community.
Well, what you said is spot on. Well, for me, the faithful presence is very useful as well, because if faithful presence requires interaction with difference, otherness, then it is
Yeah.
necessarily
Yes.
self-defense. Like you're going to have to engage in self-defense. And to me, self-defense entails disagreement, but in a certain deftness as well. Because it's inevitable if you put yourself in places that are different, like the Tower of Babylon, you will be tempted, or people will disagree with your faithful presence. What you have to learn, like self-defense in the way I think about it with Hume, is a certain sort of skillful disagreement where you learn how to disagree by you. But here's the key: disagreement must be used to maintain the space of faithful presence, not your ego. So what's the difference
Right.
between
But that's
disagreement?
totally different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
But
and you and that's where thinking in terms of architecture and art is the key metaphor to all of this, because things like
how do you,
disagreement, we're not even good at even thinking about disagreement because that term is framed within a metaphor of information exchange versus how to
yeah.
protect a sacred space, right? Well, you
And
protect
so
the
that's
sacred
what,
space with self-defense, please.
yeah, there's something about structuring the space to enable the spirit to participate, that then you have to structure a space,
Mm-hmm.
that then you're vulnerable to a bad faith audience member hearing the rules of the space and then gaming the rules of the space for their own egoic
Yes.
manipulation and glorification.
Yes.
And so, how do you design a structure that isn't a structure that is attractive to people who want to fake the structure to game the system?
Yes.
How do you create a faithful structure that is attractive to other people looking for faithful engagement of humiliation, of having the honest truths and being, you know what I mean? Like, so, again, I'm getting kind of lost here,
No.
but I think what we're trying to do is faithfully engage in these spaces for faithful development, which requires self-humiliation.
Yep.
But I think that's kind of the opposite of the modern, oh, well, find yourself an echo chamber where everybody will be nice to you and encourage you to keep thinking exactly how you've always thought your whole life.
Yep.
And so there's something
Well,
there where it's like, yeah, we tend to, so I see in some of these conversations that people are having this, okay, we're going to be here and we're going to be honest, but then you kind of get that and you kind of see people with their own little agendas and they're still their little egoic presence in there. And so I want to get better at understanding how to, I don't know, refine your discernment or your judgment such that you are encouraging a living participation in a living philosophy rather than a narcissistic, egoic, psychopathic manipulation of the structure for self-aggrandizement or something like that. Because I think, again, our society has structured us that way.
yes.
And so when we take these systems out into the public, they're just so susceptible to
Yes.
exploitation.
Yes. Yes.
And so how do we make a mass movement that's open to the mass audience, but isn't so easily corruptible by the masses?
Correct.
And so like there needs to be some limitation of like, hey, you can only play with us if you agree to be a good ethical person. But then that in itself is just easily bullshittable and like,
Yep.
kind of whatever. And then like, yeah, I don't know why I keep trying to think my way out of this,
No, what you're getting, the structure has to be primarily more like a hip hop cipher than anything else. The hip hop cipher is a very unique structure in that no one has any idea what's going to happen until it is there. And you also can't take the cipher with you. It's stuck in the evanescence of the moment. It requires skill. It requires training outside of it.
It requires presence.
It requires presence. And all it is a circle. It's a very simple structure. And yet it's magical to the people who can do it, right? So likewise, the jazz improvisation. Like, a jazz improvisation, if done well, cannot be taken with you. It is not quantifiable. Also, you really don't get much status with it necessarily. In fact, in America, people who do improvisation can be seen as bad as music because they can't read sheet music, maybe, right? It can be laughed at. Hip hop can be laughed at, right? Because it's not real music, right? Anytime you have a structure that actually is dealing with the problem you're describing, it will be seen by some people as not real or not counting or stuff like that, right? But that's actually the self-defense from the quantification and institutional logics that can run in and contribute to bad actors or things like that, right? Because also,
so that's the whole point. Okay, so sorry. If you're going to try to get into real change, then it's not about creating structures that bad actors can infiltrate. The point of making real change is to inspire people to become good actors, to be more faithfully present, to be more integrated and honest and seeking the through line of goodness rather than being exploitive and getting the facticity and winning today's game.
Yes.
And so how do you encourage people to play the infinite game that takes momentary suffering and humility and difficult conversations and then refines that into some sort of golden wisdom of future well-lived life or happiness or whatever, like the enjoy in a structure that you've created that's meaningful and makes sense to you. Yeah, there's something about what I just mapped out that almost sounds like a unicorn. It sounds like it's not real. Like it sounds like it's not present in society. And so if we're trying to be a visionary and create these things or to provide more arenas for the development of these things, I don't know. That's why I'm trying to play with these ideas.
Well, the funny thing is if we knew it was present in society, that means it would be quantifiable and captured by institutional logic, right? Like by definition, what the thing is, you must never think exists. Because if you knew it existed, then it would be something that was already susceptible to the problem, right? It's like basically Kierkegaard talking about the secret agent kind of thing, right? And well, this is for me, just as a note, this is why I like to think about studying history, not to avoid the mistakes, but to see what is possible. And you need to study history on a small scale. And when you study history on a small scale, what you see is basically movements that have been forgotten that have actually radically transformed the world. So as a quick example, I've been reading The Nordic Secret, which is on the school system in the Nordic nations, like, the Netherlands, not the Nether. I always confuse those, the Nordic together. But you had a school system there with like the Dana, different nations like that, the Swedish, et cetera, so forth. And this school system had a new educational idea of basically full personal development between 1850 and 1950. And then these nations became some of the richest in the world. And people in that school system that were located in, they did a version of that school in Tennessee. Those people actually were the leaders of the civil rights movement, like Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King had involvement in the school system, right? So also too, when you look at Randall Collins' intellectual, you know what basically made the world? What made the world were guys sitting around a bar having conversations, rather it be the Scottish Enlightenment, rather it be Bloomsbury, I can go on, Vienna Circle. You cannot underestimate the extraordinary power of simply people having conversations to make the world, which makes sense if Jonathan Rauch is right in Kindly Inquisitors that it's basically conversation by which we know anything at all. It's the sorting mess. Kindly Inquisitors is an extremely critical book. And then you have Dietrich McCloskey arguing that basically what led to the great enrichment between 1670 and the 1800s, which is where the average person on planet Earth goes from living on a penny a day to $100 a day, but just skyrockets like crazy in terms of technology, is a change in rhetoric. There was a change in how people talked about work, a change in how they talked about individual dignity, and that inspired the Dutch, basically the Great Enrichment, right? At the center of history are examples where what have made prosperity have been things you would never think made prosperity. It's basically transformation of ideas, right? Now, critically...
That's right, yeah. And it's the ability it's to transform agents so that agents can transform ideas or something.
Now, critically... what I like to talk about, so there's always the debate between the material condition and the idealistic condition. Is it a change of material or an idea that leads first? I would argue history shows it's a change of the medium condition, which is an architecture that incubates a different way people think. So an example of a medium is the printing press, the internet, the phone.
How do we change the way people think? Yeah, we need the tipping point of a different medium that creates like an incentive landscape to call forth a different spiritual engagement.
100%. Because once you get, so for example, once you have the geography of the sea, you have the printing press, you have the ability to exchange information, to keep records and books and different things. You put all those things together, and then you have a change of the idea that people should have dignity, partly due to the Protestant Reformation, and that work actually is participation in the kingdom. Well, it turns out you have an explosion of invention because people are then tinkering with ideas on how to make air conditioning because it matters.
Their work matters. Yeah,
they
care about their work because it matters to them.
That's correct. So what changes the world is the change in the medium condition, because mediums are architectures that inspire ciphers. Mediums.
So then, that gets me then back to God. I don't know why I keep bringing this up, but this window of like possible discourse seems to be reciprocally narrowing, and that seems to be guaranteeing us towards more foolishness. And so then it's like this reopening or this rebroadening or revivifying the language, or I don't know. There's something I keep wrestling with there, and I don't know. It's kind of awkward on a talk, but there's something there that I keep thinking about.
Well, I like to say that the great challenge today is basically the debate of Kafka and rhetoric. Now, because basically Kafka is to me a description of what happens to the world. All of Kafka novels is where a character gets an idea in their head. There's no Orwell Big Brother or Huxley pleasure to trick them. They get an idea, and by their own choice, by how they understand the situation, trap themselves to their death, or they basically. They are their own big brother. There is no big brother, only us. And the term is discourse. The discourse organizes you towards your own entrapment, like Joseph K. in a Kafka novel or something like that, right? Well, what McCloskey shows in others is that if you can introduce rhetoric, as she calls it, not meaning it in the bad way that some people mean it, but rhetoric being a change in rhetoric, which is this basically geometry, well, then rhetoric changes the world. And you can look at the world as a spiritual war between discourse and rhetoric, basically. And because these are what structure consciousness, right? So discourse is affliction, rhetoric is attention. Discourse, you could say, is kind of this single logic, AA, equal sign. Rhetoric would be equivalence, AB, dialectic to speculation, right? So what's very hopeful is that although it is hard to get rhetoric, or I've also called it voicecraft, inspired by Tim, is that what's very encouraging is that it's very hard to get, but if you get it, the amount of wealth and motivation and meaning and that it generates, even as a small percent, even if it's only 8% of people, changes the entire world. And this is key because there's always an idea that to change the world, you have to get the majority to change. Not necessarily, because rhetoric is so powerful that if 8% of people do it, which by the way, on planet Earth would be close to a billion, would be millions upon millions of people, please note, then the amount of impact that those people have on their immediate networks and those circles and the ideas they introduce and the different ways of doing church, et cetera, so forth, is so vast that it's then enough of a presence to attract people to see it being done. 8% basically provides enough modeling for most people to be able to see it on reason, which then they buy into it because it works, and then you start having the spread matter occur, which you can do without falling into the scaling temptation of climbing to the top, up, down, right? So if you have a change in rhetoric, you then have, by a change in the medium condition, which I basically think is afforded by the social coordination mechanism. I basically think, in my opinion, what we're doing now is actually an entirely different medium. It is not merely, it is a different medium. It is not the same as, say, Twitter, Instagram, or just searching on the web. If you are using the internet to have conversations like this with people around the world, and you're coordinating social relations, and a lot of people who are meeting online like we are then meeting in person and doing in real life activities back and forth, this is a different medium. It is not merely a repetition of the 90s internet. It creates a different way of socializing. Now, of course, it can lead to the temptation of just doing this and nothing else. So then the question is, how do you keep it from becoming insular? Which gets back to the original question. So for me, everything, we go back to this, everything is about maintaining this, the upwardness, that you never are doing this, right? It's all about maintaining the upward, right? Because the moment you do this, you identify, and it's that problem we said, right? So how do you always maintain this directionality? Because any social arrangement, it can be in church, it can be in government, it can be online, it doesn't matter. Every social arrangement always could make this mistake, right? And then you get the flattening, right? We have to maintain geometry, right? There is always the temptation of algebra, the danger of algebra, wherever there's geometry, because geometry can always be reduced back into algebra. That's always a possibility. So the question is, how do we maintain the conditions of possibility to lower the probability of that mistake, right? Like what can be done to lower that? And that's an architectural thing. Well, let's look at the hip hop cipher. If also please note in a cipher, a lot of people who think they're really good enter and then they find out they're not so good. But it wasn't a personal attack. It wasn't where someone personally attacked them. It was the lack of skill that actually made them face that reality. And so that can also be taken as, I need to get better. Whereas if you disagree with people or you humble them in a way they need, but it's not skill-based, you sometimes run the risk of that then destroying them too much, right? But when it's a skill-based disagreement, or it's a lack of skill, that can actually turn into inspiration, right? But it will only turn into inspiration if they bought into the beauty of the activity, if they have bought into the beauty of this, or they believe in it, right? And so this is where what has to be critical is the thing that maintains this is going to be tied to things like beauty. It is going to be tied to things like people seeing intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is huge, where people are choosing to have these discussions and they don't have to be, right? So you go, well, they must genuinely believe in it then, right? And they're never bored because they always have something to do. So that's beautiful to people. I think also this suggests the critical role of lifelong learning. And you see, the problem is we've associated lifelong learning with this kind of nicety, and we say it's nice, and then we read newspapers, which really isn't learning. Lifelong learning is lifelong wrestling with the transcendent, okay?
Changing. Yeah.
It's the changing. So if you're engaged in a life where you're like, wow, the beautiful is infinite, and there's more to learn, and I need to be engaged in lifelong learning, then you are always in a mode of thinking that is open to more. That you also realize that no matter how much of that more you get, there's more left. And that naturally creates a disposition of moving upward. So likewise, if you get in a conversation online like this with 10 people, and everyone there is engaged in that same mode of openness, What will naturally occur is topics will come up that other people haven't heard or that reformats their way of thinking, and they themselves will be inspired to keep learning, and they're not allowed to be stagnant. So the disagreement is part of the structure because of the lifelong committing to the learning, because you keep moving the bar, per se. You keep moving the bar, and if you move the bar and people
The
don't move with it,
anti-stasis.
yes, the
The word that
anti-stasis
came.
force, because the virtue
Yeah.
of disagreement,
Because evil thrives off of that stasis, and so you
yes,
create an environment where there is no stasis, and
that's
then
correct.
only goodness can participate, something like that.
Exactly. And then people like, and also if you have no status to offer, then that right there fights bad actors. And also, if people go, well, also, if you continue to learn, eventually what will occur is people who say, don't do that, will naturally drift, which can sound bad, but not necessarily, because they may have some personal work that they need to do in a different area, and then 2 years later they come back, or different things. This is also a critical point. We have not had the ability to have social organization that allows people to be part, leave, and come back easily, because you feel very left
Yeah.
behind, right? But here's the critical thing. If the videos are online and you leave for 2 years, you can catch up and come, and people, and you overcome what's called the introduction problem. The introduction problem, or getting people
Yeah.
back up to speed, has been one of the key things that have destroyed churches and community, because you almost have, like, you have to re-get people up to speed, and it's energy, it's entropy, and you're tired. But if they can do it on their own in their own time, then people can actually chart their own, dare I say, developmental course in a manner that lets them come back to community when it's time, right? And see, one of the reasons I would say people become also bad actors is also because they want to, they're afraid of drifting or getting lost, and they want to possess the community. They want to possess it and make
Right.
sure they never lose
Right.
it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have to
Yeah.
create mechanisms where that goes away, where people can drift, they can leave, but then in
Right.
leaving, they can
Yes.
realistically come back, right? Well, this
Yeah.
combination of YouTube and online allows the possibility of people to leave and then realistic come back. Some people have a kid. We just had our fourth kid, right? You get very busy. They're busy for 4 months. Well, and a lot of times, if you're out of the conversation for 4 months, it's just too much work to come back. Not anymore, because you can do it in the 20 minutes when you're doing the dishes. You can do it here and there, and you can do it at your own time. And then when you come back, it's like no time passed at all. Maybe there's a time where you've got your fill of philosophy. You've done enough of the conversations, and now you need to start the business. Now you need to start maybe you need to do some other things, right? But I promise you, as you do those other things away from philosophy, the day will come where you need to say, come back to those conversations, right? They're still there. They're still happening. So you have a structure that allows people to, particularly in their own way, come and go and be involved to the manner that they are at, that allows them to be particularized and unique in their circumstance for what they're going for,
Yeah.
while simultaneously
Specific engagement.
maintaining a harmony. This was not possible until basically 2018. This is a very new technology, and but it allows overcoming some of these structural problems that are really dire. Because the other thing that it does, and then I'll stop, lifelong learning is a necessary component of this. The
Yeah.
only people in most of history who could realistically do lifelong learning were on colleges, because you are not going to do lifelong learning if you are alone. You need other people around you that are doing it. And if you do it alone, then you're alienated from all the people around you, because they have no idea what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Now,
Absolutely.
now is the possibility of blue collar people of all ages interacting and doing lifelong learning outside of college. Which, what's the problem with learning? It was what? Institutionally captured. It was captured by the agendas of colleges, right? Well, what colleges offered, basically a plausibility structure of lifelong learning, is no longer monopolized there. Now it is possible to actually break it up around the world across all professional classes and ages, so you get that diversity of difference and particularization, while simultaneously the possibility of interaction. And also, lifelong learning is the general caveat, but in lifelong learning is like millions of differences. There are millions of different ways to engage in lifelong learning, right? So you have a unity while also having difference going on.
Yeah, I think there's something about, again, to rehash the metaphorical substrate of the words we're using, lifelong learning seems to be more like wisdom, and
Yes.
then modern society seems more like a factory of remember these things, get this grade,
Yes.
get this certificate, and then you have learned all that you need to learn, and now you can move forward.
Yeah.
And there's a a big spiritual undertone in the difference there.
Huge.
And then something, I don't know, that kept coming up while you were talking, and it's obviously way out there. But if a worldview is like a framework, and then that framework is like a prism, and your personality is like a prism, and then your lights and eyes, your eyes and your perception deals with the movement of light, and the movement of light is the transfer of energy through your personality, and the transfer of energy through your personality is like light going through a pyramid that then projects into shapes. And so then the shapes of your perception are informed by the structure of your personality, your pyramid, something like that. And so what we are trying to do in this conversation, I think, is recognize that the general structure of the pyramid of the mass collective personality is has been formed around a materialistic paradigm of parroting propaganda of whatever, of representations.
Hmm.
And so we're kind of recognizing that people have built their personality on oversimplified materialistic paradigms of linear rational thinking. And this has structured their personality in a pyramid such that no matter what energy you put in there, they project out this linear, intuitive,
Yep.
rational thing.
Yep.
And so, what we are then trying to do is encourage people to see beyond that, or to have a spiritual transformation to complexify that.
Yep.
And so, if Solzhenitsyn says the line between good and evil lies within every human heart,
Right.
and then if every person, if every human is like a personality that has that, and then if McGilchrist says it's the kind of attention that you pay makes all the difference in the world, it almost seems as though we create an internalized sage or an internalized nage or an internalized guide, that to gauge our personality. It's like a moral compass, our sense of conscientiousness or our conscience or something. That is like the God image that then sets our value structure,
Yes.
that then the world projects itself in light of that value
Hmm.
structure, in light
Hmm.
of how that's been shaped. And so to me, it seems as though collective unconscious has been shaped in a materialistic paradigm. And the line between good and evil and the spirit that we can do that is a transformation of abandoning the spiritual paradigm and seeing more into unity or multidimensional thinking and trans paradigmatic thinking. And so we almost need to get the person to willfully go into their own unconscious and reshape their personality in such a way that the light that they then perceive as they move through the world doesn't charge the world as a series of materialistic
Yes. Hmm.
conquests to exploitatively conquer. We need to re-go in there and build our personality to be like a sage that guides us towards connection and adaptation and love or something like that. Again, words are breaking down here,
Yep.
but it's almost like we have, or earlier what I was saying about the pyramid and then how we aim lower and then aim lower and then we mistake our identity for a lower thing. I think that paradigm of the pyramid of the unidimensional plane of reality is the artificial bars of our spiritual prison that's confining ourselves.
Oh.
And so it's like, how do you encourage each individual to do their own psychic work, to deal with their own karma, to confront their own shadow, to wrestle their own dragon, so that they can reshape their own dragon in such a way that difference is then seen as an excited thing to be interested in and to integrate and to rise into and above, or to relate to and transcend, rather than some sort of static framework where the other is wrong and we need to
Yep.
either eliminate or kill,
Yep.
or like this weird.
Yep.
So it's like it's a personality change, it's a spiritual change. It's when you were talking.
Everything you said is 100% correct. And all of that can only occur if it moves into the realm of habits, which habits are a result of
Right, so
our.
you need like a place to embody and to habit and to ritualistically
Mhm.
practice
Yes.
living these
Yes.
things.
Yes.
And so how
100%.
do you do that when we're all 500 miles apart talking through a computer screen?
Well,
I mean, obviously we're kind of faking it here as we go, but But at some point, we have to realize that this is a simulacrum of a simulacrum of the ideal way of relating, or something like that.
Sure, sure. Which then gets into the importance of, first off, the likelihood of us ever meeting, or many of the people online meeting and having these, you could say, very much encouraging or opening
Right?
conversations is not there. The question, it has to be set up in a relation with one's real life and what you are doing, and they have to feed off one another, right? It may not
Right.
be
As
the
they
exact same,
integrated.
yeah, they have to be integrated. It may not be with the same people online simply because of
But the same spirit.
because if it
Yeah.
has to be, then there are economic and occupational blah 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 limits to that. It could be.
All
I think
sorts
you
of.
will see people moving to be closer to one another based on these interactions, but it doesn't have to be, as long as the space online forms the discernment, judgments, ability to judge the mean, geometry, and habits that are needed to carry this out in the life
Right. So
around you.
then it's a characterological development. Then
Yes.
what you're trying to do is change somebody else's pyramid of personality structure,
Yes.
so that then, regardless of the facticity they find themselves in, they can resonate towards the good.
Yes. That's exactly right. So if it's all because basically habit is character in Aristotle, and
Right. Right.
virtue is
And
habit and all of
that's the
that.
spirit, that's the spirit that interprets the world. That's the prism that
Yes.
projects the light. And like that's who you are. That's your identity. And
Completely.
so the identity is on the shape of your perceptive lens,
Correct.
not your job or your facticity or your hair color or whatever the hell people care about these
Correct.
days. But
Correct. Um, so for example, perhaps there are in Norfolk, Virginia, or something, there are 74 people who are engaging in geometry in the way we are describing, and they feel alone. And because you have had these conversations online and know people online, you may have the confidence to say, begin a home church where you're looking for people like that. And for the
Mhm.
first 2 years, only 3 people come. And if you didn't have the online space, you might get discouraged and quit. But because you have the
Right, yeah.
online space,
Okay.
you're
Okay, I
able
see
to
where
maintain
you're
it.
going.
And
Yeah.
then gradually you can find the others in your immediacy who then, knowing you do it, can on their own build their own confidence to do their own thing, right?
Because even if you don't realize it in Virginia, you can realize it online. And so
Exactly.
then there's multiple dimensions of reality. And by realizing these things on more and more dimensions of reality, that makes them more and more realistically incorporatable to all dimensions, which then makes them
Exactly.
closer and closer to the depth of our personality, which is then closer to deep, meaningful psychological change,
100%.
which I think is what we're all after in the meaning crisis, is a
Yes.
psychological change. We're
Yes,
having an
we are.
identity crisis.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
how do we improve the structure of our identity? How do we and then now it sounds solipsistic or narcissistic or delusional to say like how do we design our optimal personality so that we're perfect?
Yep.
Like, well, that's not really what I'm saying, but like, yeah. So I don't know. How do you care about making yourself better without top down? Oh, I'm just going to be better, and
Yeah.
then I'm using my own standards of judgment, and then I'm finding myself in that delusional cycle of whatever.
Well, it's an excellent
And so, how do
question.
you care appropriately without getting lost in the objects of your care or the representations of your care?
No, it's an
Yeah,
excellent
something.
question. And if the primary way that one becomes more perfect is facing fears, then it's not necessarily something to get excited about, right? We associate perfection with never having anything go wrong. But if like when
Right.
Jesus is like, be perfect, if that
But
more
that's
is
not
a,
adaptable. Adaptability and perfection are almost opposites.
that's correct.
And so then we make the problem of thinking in categories of equivocating. What'd you say? Equality and
Equal,
equivalence.
yeah, that's
Those
right.
aren't those aren't that's a
Yep.
misequivocation there.
That's correct. And so perfect is tied to courage, and courage is always hard. The problem is we associate perfect with meaning you no longer have difficulty. To be ye perfect means you're always prepared for hardship, right? There is no perfection as a stable state. There's perfection as in you were perfect in that wrestling match. You were perfect in that situation time and time again because you were prepared for it. And perfection is not, say, a glory to
I
you.
think
Please.
I think there's a danger in the metaphor there because I kind of agree with what you're saying. There's a way to perform optimally. But I
Yes.
think pedantically speaking, maybe it's just my bias, but pedantically speaking, I associate perfection with almost that abstract certainty that is
Sure.
unrealistic.
Sure. 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 Sure.
And so
Sure.
I think we say, oh, that was perfect. Oh, that was
Yeah.
perfect. Oh, that
Yeah.
was perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
actually just kind of a metaphor that might actually be confusing because then that buys into the assumption that there actually is a real
Yes.
perfect. But no, we're not aiming at being perfect. We're
No,
aiming at being an optimized functioning person. And so
no,
there's
that
something, yeah,
100%. The word perfect has become problematic. In thinkers like
yeah, yeah,
Aquinas, your thumb is perfect if it works. This is a perfect thumb
Right?
because a thumb is the problem
If
is the
it
word
functions, yeah.
if it
The
functions.
structure, if the
Yes.
structure and the function are aligned with the
Yes.
intention, then
Yes.
structure, function, attention,
Yes.
agency, environment all
Yes.
have to appropriately relate.
Yeah, the problem is the word perfect is now used outside of alignment. And so it's become almost a
Yeah,
useless word. And history, look, there are words that can be useful in the past that become useless in the future because it's too
yeah,
bogged down, right? So it's
yeah.
alignment. So if we're talking about, quote unquote, we all do want to work very hard at being aligned. Also, if I'm the pianist on Beethoven's Ninth, I want the violinist to be, quote unquote, perfect or great, right? Because if he's not, we can't make music, right? So the key is that when we start thinking about getting better, seeking greatness in a communal context, then it is fundamentally anti-egoic because the aim of the community can never
Right.
be something you alone can do,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, I want to get there. That brings me to another point. I've often because I'm a philosophy guy, and people are always like, "Why the hell are you interested in philosophy?" And I was talking on a live stream, and some guy in the comments was like, because I was telling him one of the points of philosophy is to get to aporia, and the part of aporia is you realize that what you were thinking doesn't make sense, and
Yeah.
so you had been living, I don't know, confidently or narcissistically that your idea was correct. And then reality has smacked you in the face and
Yeah.
told you that your little system didn't work.
Yeah.
And so then this is like a moment of humility and transition. And
Yeah.
then I read a meme. There was like a little picture that said the point of philosophy is to sadden or something like that. And so again, it's this humility. And
Yeah.
then when you speak the virtues of humility to the masses, they're like, why would you ever want to be less than? Or why would you ever want to fail? Or why would you ever want to be humiliated? Like, why would you ever want to reach a state of aporia? Why would you ever want to realize you don't know what you're talking about? Like, isn't that horrifying? Isn't that terrible? Isn't that the opposite of what you would want to do? And then that kind of brings me into that thing we are getting on earlier, the in antidromia, or when is a good thing good and when is a bad thing bad? It's like, when is recognizing that you're wrong actually the right way to live?
Yep.
When is seeing your flaws actually the way to being a perfect person?
Yes.
Like, when is yeah, I don't know. That was interesting to me.
That's 100%. Well, basically, there's a way in which, again, so you either have this massive centralized devastation forcing function that comes along and is really, really difficult, or you can do philosophy, and I would argue churches as well, where basically you break up or decentralize the devastations and bring them ahead, make the transformation, and then you don't need this gigantuous forcing function because you bring it ahead and it becomes much more manageable because it's broken up, you could say, right?
Mm.
Like what we've done is by not having, say, religion or philosophy or the humanities in general, basically then the only forcing function we don't have a culture that brings forward
Just
the
go. Right.
devastation. So the only option is a big devastation, meta crisis, and it has to be that which is the forcing function, right? Because, critically, in Raymond, Owen and Agon, he talks about this, and it's very true. Plato, he has the tripartite soul, obviously, eros, logos, and themos, right? And you have to have all three. You have to have eros, desire, logos, rationality, themos, courage, we can associate. You have to have all three, right? Plato understood that all three are in war with all the others. Logos wants to get rid of thymos, eros wants to get rid of logos. They all want to get rid of one another, and you have to maintain all three. Plato is asking the question with Socrates, how do you maintain all three in a successful society? This is critical. It's actually not hard to maintain all three in a bad society because you'll die if you don't. The key is that in a successful society, one of those three or two of them are going to gang up against the one, and then you're in huge trouble, right? So, for example, I would argue that after the end of history with Francis Fukuyama 1990s Washington Consensus, what ended up happening is that Logos and Eros joined up in a war against Thymos. They got rid of Thymos, which is basically the body, the serious play Viveki, courage, character, virtue. They teamed up and they got rid of Thymos. Here's the problem. Without Thymos, Logos and Eros become cancerous, and they become forces of self-destruction, right?
Yeah, here we
So
are. We're in a toxic society. Yeah.
that's correct, because we got rid of basically the meaning crisis is a themos crisis. It's strongly
Lack of
tied with
spirit. Yeah.
themos.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. The reason why you need philosophy is because philosophy makes you realize you need something when facticity says you don't need it. In the
Right.
90s,
That's the when you realize the incompleteness, where you realize you're
yes,
dependent on something else, where you see through the illusory self-referential
Yes.
nature of your thing. It's where you see that dependency.
Yes. That's
And so
correct.
then that's the treatment to narcissism. And that's what I think the whole, yeah, the biblical tradition is like, hey, humans are rational creatures. And then that rationality gives you a dopamine high. And then that
Yes.
dopamine high gives you arrogance. And then that arrogance gives you ignorance. And that
Yes.
ignorance gives you foolishness.
Yes.
So be really fucking careful when you start thinking you know things.
Yeah,
Like when
that's
you
correct.
eat of the fruit of tree, when you build your personality as though you know right from wrong, you are on an incredibly dangerous, slippery slope to
Absolutely.
hell.
Absolutely.
And I don't
Absolutely.
think anybody in our society even thinks like that at all. Like to me, that should be like the underlying narrative of the communal
Yep.
landscape that
Hmm.
brings us
Hmm.
together. And
Hmm.
we're all oriented around the sanity of trying not to get lost in our ideas.
Yes. No,
But
I
actually, I think our society just encourages us to be more and more lost in your ideas. Oh yeah,
what
yeah, you think that, oh, you're good. Yeah, you be you. You're great just how you are. Just keep being delusional and double down on that.
well,
And
basically, I would make the claim that the revival of church is completely dependent on moving into this kind of messaging, actually. Because right now because you could say church has been in decline, I think
right.
primarily because its messaging has been sin as immorality, not irony. I'm just calling all of this irony or enclosure and all that, right? Church and the Bible make a whole lot more sense when you start seeing it in this structure, this
Right.
narrative
That's what I'm saying.
structure.
Okay, if the medium is the message, or if the medium is the structure that then projects the color of the image that then makes it valuable. Um, image. Ah, shit. Never mind. Sorry. Go on.
Well, I think ultimately it comes. So before I forget a few more things, I think it also helps if we think of the love of wisdom as a love of encounter and surprise, because wisdom always surprises. That's why it's not merely knowledge. So when you understand philosophy as a love of surprise, then that tie, and which I would associate with the structure of the cipher, then that right there has a certain humility. You never think you're entirely right because if you're right, then you no longer can be surprised. You're no longer nimble. You're not like there's something about philosophy and a certain nimbleness, the ability to judge and discern the mean and play. Also, there's something playful, a serious play in that. Then it makes a whole lot more sense what the love of wisdom is, right? And a lot of people have different understandings of what wisdom is, but I do think wisdom has something to do with the ability to be prepared for the unexpected, for the surprise, for something to
It's
sort
about,
of,
yeah, it's about the unexpected. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's
Knowledge
strong.
is about what's known. Wisdom
Yes,
is about what
yes,
is not
no.
there. And
And
so then it's
wisdom,
that ability to see what matters that isn't there.
yes,
And so
that's
how is
it.
that like where's the imagination to delusion?
Yes,
Where is the genius to the insanity? Where is the,
yes.
yeah,
No, that's 100%. And so for Plato, a successful society is going to be a place where the thing you need is not there. And so you need philosophy almost as civil servants to remind you, hey, I know you're not seeing Thymos and it doesn't seem like you need it, but I'm going to remind you do. And that's why memory
right.
is a big deal.
So then the philosopher is the prophet. If
Yeah.
God's creatures are, supposed to stay in line with God and then they get bogged down by desires of man and desires of the flesh, then the philosopher is the prophet that reminds
Yes.
the community to get back on the right track.
Yep. Yep.
And so we here as the philosophers are seeing the patterns and recognizing that the system is tending towards capitalistic AI non-self tyranny. And so we're seeing the need to see into the next paradigm, to transition through the next paradigm.
Yeah. No. Well,
But
and
but then the listeners of our message, the ones that need to be inspired by the message, are those who are going to take the message and misinterpret it. And
sure.
so our actual goal is characterological change that will then reinterpret our message better, rather than how do
Yeah.
we define a message that'll
Yes.
fix the
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah. That's
And
it.
so there's
Yeah.
that we're trying, the medium is the message, but then we're trying to use the medium as a personality transformation. And
Yes.
so
Yes.
the aim is the personality, but then we have
Yes.
to use the medium, but then the
Yes.
medium confines the person. And
Yes.
then how do you get that? I'm translating it into reduction so that you get it into a,
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, there's something there where I think yeah,
I think
the
that's
medium is the
huge.
message, and if the point is to change somebody else, but then you have to use a method, yeah, a medium, and yeah,
Yep.
sorry, you talk.
No, that's all magnificent. And I think profit is very important. To speak generally, the philosopher as prophet is the one that is keeping you on track in success, where the technician gets you back to success when you make a mistake, right? So if you screw up and everyone can see you screw up, then all you need is the technician, right? And he'll get you
Right.
straight.
So people are looking for doctors, not therapists. They're looking to go to somebody to take a pill to fix them. They're not looking to somebody to challenge them to develop a new skill so that they
Exactly.
can then live on their own.
Exactly.
And
And
so when your audience is looking for a doctor, how do you be a philosopher?
that's correct.
Because people don't care about philosophy. You're a fucking idiot if you philosophize. You're
Yeah.
just wasting your time.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
so how do you create a spiritual transformation in a society who is spiritually disposed towards being anti-spirited towards the medium of your message?
Yeah. The other thing that's happening now is the philosopher also as prophet can be like, the thing coming is so severe that if it occurs, you won't have a chance to go to the doctor. You need to get
Right,
better now, right?
right.
Whereas,
And this is like an individual line between good and evil is within your own heart. This is like each individual's moral responsibility to take their karmic journey.
yeah,
Not like, oh, well, I'll just wait till it's broken and then I'll fix it.
yeah,
It's like, no, 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 no. Like, we need to do this before it breaks.
yeah,
Like, this is not something inconsequential that we can just let break and we'll get to it next week and whatever.
that's the key.
This is like, this is our will to live. If this breaks, like, we're done.